This screencast is the lecture on Caedmon's hymn. As you know by now, Caedmon's hymn was first written down by Bede in his ecclesiastical history. Remember what language Bede was writing in? Latin, absolutely. Don't forget that he couldn't write in English because the Roman alphabet hadn't been adapted to English at the time he was writing. So, in what language then was the first poem composed in English written in Bede's book? It had to be Latin. Bede makes a comment about translating Caedmon's hymn into Latin, saying, "This is the sense, but not the words in order as he sang them in his sleep. For verses, though never so well composed, cannot be literally translated out of one language into another without losing much of their beauty and loftiness." The first time that we see the poem written in English is here in the copy of Bede's history that appears in the Moore manuscript. The history is still in Latin, this whole part here. But a monk who was reading the history 100 years or so after it was written decided that he should translate the poem into Old English to see how it sounded. That's his translation up there in the top margin, squeezed between the top of the page and the Latin text. And this is a larger version of it, though I know it's really difficult to read. I don't have a better copy, and I'm sorry about that. So this is where English literature begins, in the margin. Uh, and I find it so ironic that such an incredible body of literature should begin as a note in the margin. Let's take a closer look at the poem in Old English. At the top of this slide, you will see the poem as it appeared in an Old English translation of Bede's history, without the start and end, of course. Um, but the scribble hand can be difficult to read, so I've provided a more legible copy down here below. Old English looks different because of some of the letters that we no longer use in modern English. For instance, the AE combination is called an ash and is pronounced ah. I'm sorry, it's pronounced ah, as in hat. Why don't we call this Caedmon's hymn then? And the reason for that is that we've Americanized the pronunciation over the years, just as we pronounce Paris rather than Paris, or Mexico rather than Mexico. So remember, the ash sounds like ah. Another letter that looks different is it looks like a P with an extension on the top. And this is called a thorn. And it's pronounced TH as in thing. The letter that looks like a D with a crossbar is called an eth. It also makes the TH sound, but it's harder than the thorn, making the sound of that. So if you were to have the word thigh, like the body part, it would be a thorn. But if you had the word thy, as in thy kingdom come, it would be using an eth. So I'll read the poem in Old English. You can read along either in Old English or in Modern English translation that you find above each line. Listen very carefully to the sound of the hymn as I read. What do you hear? Nu schulen herrigen helfen reaches werd, meo todas mata and his moja thank, where Wolders father swahi wundra je was, ichi driekten or onstilde, he era schelp earthen bernam, helfen te rof, halli schupend da midinjerd monkines werd, ichi driekten after teoda, firm folden, freya el mikti. So, did you notice that we have repeating sounds throughout the poem? Like the H sound here and here, and the M here and here. That is called alliteration. And no, alliteration is at the very heart of Old English poetry. And you find it, like I said, with the H's, the M's here, the W's in this line. And then we come to this line and it's like, oh, well, what happened to the alliteration here? But in Old English, all vowels alliterate. So we have the E, the O, and the O. So notice that the lines are divided into two spaces with this big space in the middle. That space is called a caesura, and it divides two half lines of Old English poetry. You'll find that words alliterate from one half line to the other. So you will find alliteration and caesuras in all Old English poetry, which is referred to as the alliterative style. This isn't just because of tradition. The alliteration serves a very important purpose. Any ideas? Remember, Old English didn't have a written alphabet for several hundred years after the Anglo-Saxons came to England. Think about how poetry was recited orally from one time to the next. How might alliteration help a person trying to remember many lines from a poem? This is known as a mnemonic device and is an aid to memory. So when a sound appeared in the first half line of a poem, the person reciting it knew that the sound would repeat it in the second half line, giving him a clue about what came next. That way, the Old English shopes, and this is the C, SCOP, and that's what they called their storytellers. Later, they would have been called like bards, were able to recite hundreds of lines of poetry by memory. So to finish this module, take a quiz number 3 and tests and quizzes, and then just move right on to the next wonderful text that we're going to be reading. Thank you.